Composer Linda Catlin Smith grew up in New York and lives in Toronto. She studied music in New York and at the University of Victoria. She also taught composition for many years at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, and she continues to teach privately. Her music has been commissioned, performed, and/or recorded by many artists such as Tafel Music, the Victoria, Kitchener-Waterloo, and Vancouver Symphony Orchestras, Array Music, Thin Edge Collective, Continuum, and Tapestry New Opera, as well as soloists including Eva Goyen, Philip Thomas, and Eleanor Fry. She has had performances at the Tectonics Festival in Glasgow, Huddersfield Music Festival, Principal Sound Festival, and Louth Contemporary Music Festival in Ireland. The BBC Proms commissioned a new orchestral work entitled Nuage, premiered in 2019 by the BBC Scottish Orchestra. Several solo discs of her music have been released, including Thought and Desire with Eva Goyen, Ballad with Eva Goyen and Andrew Smith, Meadow with Louth Contemporary Music Society, and 5 recordings, Dirt Road, Drifter, Wanderer, Among the Tarnished Stars with Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, and Ballad on the Another Timbre label. Some of her works are now available through Composer's Edition. Here is my interview with composer Linda Catlin Smith. I'm your host for the Redshift Radio podcast, Adrian Verdejo, podcasting from my home studio in Vancouver, BC, on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. Thank you, Linda, for joining me today, this morning in Vancouver. And I know we have a time difference in Toronto, but I really want to thank you for rescheduling and for joining me today. I've been really looking forward to speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Out here in Vancouver, unseasonably hot weather. And is it sort of the same in Toronto right now?
We're getting spring now, which is really nice. Everything's blooming. It's not too hot. It's perfect weather actually for me. I love this time of year. Finally, all the green is out.
Yeah.
It's really, really encouraging,
Yeah.
I would say.
I take it that you have some general inspiration from the natural world, and some of the elements and sort of the titles even of your pieces evoke spring-like blooming flowers, sometimes more evocative and specific topics, as I mentioned, referencing nature in particular. Do you find yourself more inspired necessarily to compose at certain times of the year?
Yeah. I mean, as far as being inspired by nature, I am truly inspired by it, but it's, in terms of the titles, it usually comes after the piece is finished. It's like, I have a piece called Nuage, which is clouds, and I actually have a piece called Clouds as well for solo vibraphone. But I didn't have those words at the beginning. They came after the piece, and it's more like, oh, this has a connection to this aspect of nature, or it seems like this. So they're more metaphorical. I have a recent piece that was just played for solo violin. It's over an hour, and it's called Dandelion. And that was a reference to dandelion is a very common flower and common plant. Some people call it a weed. But it has, even though it's common, it has some very special things about it. It's transformative. It starts one way, it becomes another way. It has things that fly in the air. It has, dragon-toothed leaves. I mean, it's an amazing plant. So for me, the simplicity and the ordinariness kind of related to the fact that I wasn't using any special techniques. It's very simple, straightforward materials in the whole piece. That's my connection to nature. In a way, it's more comes after the fact of writing. That said, I do really like thinking about the movement in nature, the oscillations and undulations of water and leaves, the way a vine sort of winds its way around in a very unpredictable manner in the garden. Those kinds of things really appeal to me as well.
You mentioned Nuage, Linda, and I know this was a piece that was commissioned and premiered, I think, by the BBC Scottish Orchestra a couple of years ago.
For the BBC Proms, yeah.
And I know that recently you were in Vancouver. How did you feel about the performance most recently with the VSO?
It was a very beautiful performance. It was very, very different than the BBC Scottish. And what I learned from that is that orchestras have different personalities and they have different styles and different ways that they naturally want to play. And I felt that uh, something that made me feel good is that the piece can stand that kind of difference, that it can stand being played by one orchestra that might have a tendency towards playing more new music with maybe less vibrato and things like that, and another orchestra that doesn't have the same sensibility but can play the piece with sensitivity. And in fact, the Vancouver Symphony gave it a very, very beautiful performance. Very, I would say they held it with respect, and they played it with their kind of sensitivity to harmony and to the textures I was trying to evoke. It was really beautiful, especially the second night was really beautiful.
So specifically the title Nuage, as I mentioned, kind of evoking specific elements of the natural world and this idea of kind of moving clouds and this slow but noticeable transformation in texture and mood and color is really kind of some of the immediate images that appear in my mind. I know this is a major theme in a lot of your works, Linda, in this blend of timbre and melody and harmony and the way that all those things are superimposed in each other in different instrumental ways of writing. Were there specific elements of timbre that gave you the initial motives or themes for this work? Or again, was there an extra musical reference that sort of triggered the impetus for this composition? How did it develop in particular, this piece Nuage?
It's really interesting to think about those beginning moments of starting a piece, because with me it usually comes, there's some kind of, I would say, a sonic image that comes to me, and it's usually something kind of particular but foggy at the same time. And in this case it was I wanted almost to get a feeling of gauze, like something you can see through, but it has a kind of delicate filmy quality to it. And I was thinking about the paintings by Jules Olitsky, some of which are almost like paint hanging in the air kind of quality, and just how can we get this transparent, slightly shimmery substance in music. And that was really my starting point. So I started the piece quite high with little strands of string sounds and some flute sounds, and um, wanting it to have something I've been working on, which is a kind of sense of mesh or independent lines, so that there's always something moving, breathing. Like when you're looking at tree leaves moving, they're all moving slightly independently. So I'm always looking for that kind of slight instability that gives it a little bit more life and suppleness. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that it's very hard to put into words these things that you're trying to get when you're starting a piece. And for me, I don't have a plan, and I don't have a storyline, and I don't have much when I start. I kind of just need that little thing to get my foot in the door, and then I just try to follow that, like pulling on a thread and seeing where it goes. So I'm usually maybe the first third or first half of the piece is a kind of a search and a discovery process, and I don't really know what it's going to be yet. I mean, I usually know the duration, but how that duration gets filled and what the form of that's even going to be. With an hour-long piece, I have a couple of those. It's like, am I doing one thing for an hour, or is it going to have sections, and what kind of sections, and does it ever look back at itself and repeat something? Those kinds of formal considerations happen in the process. They're never planned, mm-hmm. At least for me. And I'm not against planning. It just doesn't work for me.
Yeah. Looking at your works catalog, you've collaborated with so many wonderful performers and such an array of different instruments and ensembles. In that, at times using also non-traditional Western instruments, also more conventional orchestral instruments as well. To what degree does the specific collaboration with the performer, the musician, lead you down that path of inspiration, or perhaps trigger some specific ideas? Personal collaborations give you more insight into how to start the composition process.
It has a lot to do with how well I know the instruments already. So if there's an instrument that I really don't understand, I really value so much working with the performer. I had to, during COVID, I wrote a piece for hurdy-gurdy, and that's just like was way off my chart of knowledge. So over Zoom, I had several sessions with Ben Grossman and showing me the instrument and taking me through how it actually works. And that was really helpful. As far as writing for someone who I know, like if I know the person already quite well, that will inform me a lot, because I have a feeling for their approach, their touch, even their personality a little bit. But if I don't know the person, that can't help me out much, So, the hour-long violin piece I wrote was for a violinist I've never met and had not even heard that much. So then you're just in the realm of imagination. When I write for someone I know, I don't think I change all that much about what I'm going to do, but it informs me, I would say, more in the sense of giving me permission to go in a certain direction. Like I know that person can play that way, or can sustain this thing for that long, or they'll be willing to go on this journey with me. The first longish piece I wrote was a piece for a cello and piano called Ballad. And I wrote it for my brother, who's a cellist, and Eva Goyen, who's a pianist, because I knew her well. And I just knew they would both not mind playing a piece this long of mine. And I also had a feeling they would get along, and that they would get along musically, as well as personally. And they did. And so it was a real joy to bring that one to light with them.
Eve is somebody you've collaborated with on separate occasions as well. I see that you wrote a piece for her Nocturnes and Chorales some years ago as well.
Yeah, and in that one, it was really a collaboration, because she had a residency on Salt Spring Island, and I joined her there, and I brought, that piece has 9 movements, I think, and I brought 4 or 5 of them with me. And we worked on them together, and there were some notation things I was trying out, and I had no idea about the order of those movements yet. And so we really worked every day together on interpreting these fragments. And then we also brought in a little bit of an audience to listen to some of that. And that was really interesting to hear their feedback. And then that gave me a lot of information for finishing the piece. Yeah.
That was the Art Spring residency?
Yeah, Art Spring, that's it.
Yeah. Fantastic. You had mentioned these longer form compositions, and I know in the past you had studied with or listened to lectures of Morton Feldman in Buffalo when he was a lecturer there. I'm wondering to what degree your connection with Feldman inspired some of these longer form compositions, if in fact some of those mature works of Feldman were to you kind of pivotal or inspirational as a up and coming composer and composition student at that time, and seemingly some of these elements of texture and timbre and form are sort of reminiscent of some of Feldman's larger scale works. Can you tell me a little bit about your encounters with Feldman at that time and what you took from him in those lectures?
Yeah, just about the longer form works, I would say, I think actually what inspired me to do longer form works was hearing long pieces by Chris Newman and Christopher Fox in England, and Maria de Alvear from Spain and Germany. She lives. They were doing long works, hour-long works, and I think that kind of got me more on the track of that. But in terms of Feldman, I was really, really affected by some of two of his early pieces that I had. There were records of. There were only two recordings when I was in school. There was the Durations recording and the recording that had false relationships and the extended ending, which became my favorite piece for a couple of years. Couldn't stop listening to it. But meeting him and also reading his many, many lectures, many of which were in art magazines that I tracked down and photocopied for myself, gave me, I felt like they underlined or gave me permission to think about music in a more artistic way rather than an academic way, so that I could come to material as material without having to count pitches or create structures in advance, but to be, I guess, to follow my inclination, which was to be intuitive in the process. And I think much of Morton Feldman's work is that way, though I think there are some things that are also very pre-planned here and there. I liked very much the way he used in his later works, like in the long string quartet, just the patterning and the slight variation, and the kinds of colors he used really gave me actually a real sense of this is possible. So most of the people that have influenced me because they made me feel like composing was possible as opposed to shutting me down. The early works of John Cage were like that for me. Certainly, even works by Debussy and Ravel were like that, because it just opened up worlds. So in those cases, they opened up harmony for me. And so I think I've always felt with Feldman that his patience with material and the way the music draws you in and allows you to really listen to everything. I think that always made me feel very comfortable, and so that it would often be something that I would go to as okay, let me set myself up for this attitude of listening, and I would put on something either from Feldman or early Cage or Satie, or things that got me in the zone of a listening presence.
Yeah, and these pieces you mentioned in composers in that style, it's fascinating how our sense of time sort of dissipates as well with the elongated form, and as you mentioned, these kind of subtle pattern variations. Whereas a piece that is 10 or 12 minutes long, perhaps, if the form is very clear and the motive is very, very clear, the writing very clear, that sense of duration can give us a very different journey, whereas sometimes with Feldman, you find yourself in the middle of a 45-minute listening experience, and it feels like time has just sort of evaporated. I wonder about the practical considerations of writing these very long pieces, and how performers pitch the idea to you, or if it just becomes a sort of a realization at some point in the creative process that the piece needs to have this kind of elongated form to have its full sort of display of what you wanted to communicate with the piece. How do these pieces come to be, or were they just organically evolved that in that way?
Aside from ballad, which was my own idea for my own self, which came about because there was a tendency for my works to be positioned as the slow movement on a concert. So usually between two very active and busy pieces, maybe louder pieces, and I just wanted to see what would happen if I could take the whole time and not have that position. I mean, I understood the programming ideas around that, but that was that experiment for myself. But the violin solo, which was for Milan Pala, a really brilliant violinist in the Czech Republic, he asked me for it. We didn't know each other. We got introduced to each other by another composer who I'm very fond of, who I've also never met, Adrian Verdejo. And he told me he had a piece that was played by Milan, and he somehow introduced us all through email. And Milan approached me and just asked me to write it, and I decided what could be more difficult than an hour-long violin solo. So I decided to do it. And it turns out it's actually closer to 70 minutes now that he's done it.
Okay.
Plays it beautifully.
Yeah.
And so that was a request. And then the hour-long piano solo is a request from Cheryl Duval, a pianist in Toronto, who I've known for a long time. So these are just requests. I had a half-hour string trio that was a request from Eamon Quinn in Ireland for his festival a couple of years back. And so, usually if somebody asks for a duration, I try to honor that, and so again, 30 minutes, that's a new one for me. That was like, okay, I haven't done too many pieces in 30 minutes. Let me try. So I kind of and I like challenges, and I also love, the idea of doing something for 7 minutes. 7 minutes is a wonderful duration. So each time it's okay, how having the duration planted in your head immediately, it's like you've been given the size of your canvas, so it immediately orients you in the world a certain way that you at least know that, and the instrumentation. So there's something known before you take that step into not knowing.
Surely, yeah. You lived and studied in Victoria some years ago, and as a student at the University of Victoria. You had mentioned Joe Kondo as a fairly major influence in that period of your studies. And again, I think that there's some definite elements of style that we can identify in terms of color and texture and perhaps philosophy of sound. But can you elaborate a little bit further, Linda, on your time and your experience working with and studying under Joe Kondo?
Joe was such a remarkable presence. He was brought to the university, I think it was in 1980, and he taught a course in traditional Japanese music as well as a course in contemporary Japanese music, and we got to know his music a little bit as well. And it was really the class on traditional music, especially the gagaku, which blew my mind completely. And I couldn't stop listening to gagaku, even though there were only a few recordings at that time that I could find. The harmonic language of it, the pacing of it. And one of the wonderful things that Joe explained to me had to do with the idea of pulse. And that if we think of pulse as the completion of a circle, and that can be very regular, in that music, it is the same. It's the completion of a circle, but every circle is of a different size. So it's pulse that is highly irregular. And that affected me in a very big way, and kind of thinking of the background feeling of phrases or of time, so that this regularity of time could be stretched at times. So a lot of my music from that point on was in uneven meters, 3/4, 7/4, 2/4, 6/8, moving the time around a little bit. And it just opened my ears so much. And I really loved the transparency, just like I love the transparency in early music. I love the transparency in gagaku. And then Joe, there wasn't a lot of recordings of Joe's music at that time, but I stayed in touch with him and got all his recordings over the last years. And his approach to music making is very particular. A lot of Klangfarben melody in it, changing the timbral, the instrumentation almost moment by moment. And his sense of harmony is quite surprising and really fascinates me. And I just find that also fed me a lot and made me really, really comfortable with the idea that any combinations of notes work, and they're all beautiful. And then it's about finding the right registration for these combinations. And yeah, so he was also such an amazing and amusing person. He taught mostly musicology. I think he's still teaching. So his knowledge base is vast, and so he's deeply rooted in history, and yet his music is very visionary, future.
In your early musical studies, did you start on piano, Linda, or how did you start out in music?
Yeah, I started with piano. We had a piano in the house because my mother was a piano teacher. She was my teacher. Started learning playing the piano when I was about 3. I learned to read music when I was about 3 because she was teaching and I was just hanging out and I just picked it up. She suddenly realized I was actually reading the notes. But then she had to get me my own piano teacher by the time I was 5 because I fought with her miserably. I was a terrible brat when I was a kid. So yeah, piano was my I would say it was kind of like a refuge. I loved playing. The piano sounds good right away. It's not like violin, which I did take for about 5 years when I was a kid, where it takes a long time to be able to make a nice sound with violin. But the
Yeah.
piano sounds good right away, and you have access to a lot of notes at once. And so I was always fooling around and making up things, and tended to change some of the music I had to practice to make it how I liked it. It's kind of playing bits that I liked and then changing the chords.
Yeah.
So, and then I sang a lot when I was young, and even I listened to a lot of music. I had a record player in my bedroom, and I was allowed one side of a record every night as I was falling asleep. So, my mother had taken a course in music at Columbia when she was finishing her degree. She had kids, and then she went back to finish her degree. And so she had all these, she had Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, and Debussy, and Bartok, and Milhaud, and so I listened to all these records a lot. I think children are very open. So as a 5-year-old, to hear one side of a record of music by Milhaud, that was easy. It was just as much fun as listening to pop music or,
Yeah.
kids music or musicals. It's all the same.
Sure. Yeah. And your approach to piano, seeing as that is your first instrument and your background, you have a very strong familiarity with it. Do you find you approach the instrument differently, or with perhaps a different view than instruments with which you're not familiar? You mentioned the hurdy-gurdy, and I'm sure there's many other instruments where, they're a little more alien, or perhaps you have some more kind of studied knowledge about the instrument. But seeing as it's so hands-on, but it's your native instrument, do you find yourself more apt to write for the piano in a specific style, or do you approach it in a more neutral way?
I don't know if it's possible to be neutral. That's such an interesting question. Of course, we're the one pitfall, I think, when you're writing for your own instrument is you come up against your own technique, and or in my case, lack of. I don't have a lot of versatility in terms of my technical abilities, but I have worked with, I have run things by other pianists to make sure things are doable if I want to go past what I can play. But often I'm quite satisfied with things that I can sort of get my hands around. I wouldn't say I can play my own music. I would never want to play my own music publicly. Other people would play it much better. They have more command. But what I do feel I have, and I think it guides me, and maybe this is what you have and guides you in your work too, is a sense of touch with the instrument. For me, touch is not just the physical hands-on touch that we have with the instrument itself, but it's the imaginative touch that we have about how we know it's going to sound because we're close to it. So there's that sense of gifted touch. I have a little bit of it with string instruments because I did play for a while. I understand bowing a little bit, have that feeling. Same with singing. There's that inherent, and I did play flute for a number of years in a folk music situation. But with piano, every time I write a new piano piece, I try to find something new for myself. The whole thing might not be new, but there's got to be some little discovery for me in well, pretty much in every piece. I can't get away from being who I am or being involved in the sounds I love or I'm drawn to, let's say. You don't have to love everything you write, you know? You can actually write some things that you don't quite like at all, but they have to be there because the piece needs it. But I do feel if I can just move past the familiar, and that might mean finding new sonorities, it might mean finding new approaches, it might mean asking for a limitation for myself. Okay, the last few pieces I did featured a lot of chords. Okay, I'm going to work without chords. Or I'd like to have, I feel that this section needs no pedal. I love pedaling with the piano, but let me try dry. Or with the violin, let me try, a section with just the tiniest bit of hair in the wood. I never do that. Let me see what I can do with that. So it's always that little bit of stepping out. And then the minute you do that, it teaches you something new. Automatically, it renews and reinvigorates the process and allows you to have that discovery, which, is one of my favorite parts of the piece. I noticed that in the piece I'm working on now, one of the pieces I'm starting, I'm just in the very initial stages of looking for what kind of material I might want for this piece. And I had that one day where I came across some material that I just didn't understand at all. And I thought, well, okay, that might be something because I don't get it. And that's what I like, is to get to that point.
So there's an element of problem solving or uncovering sort of some element
It's
of
just
mystery.
an element of like strangeness. Like, is this anything that I can work with? And I don't know what it is, and I don't know what I can do with it. And therefore my mind, the brain loves limitations, and it loves the unknown in a sense of like, it's like when you come across a path in nature and you haven't walked that path before, part of you really wants to go and see what's there. And so that's a feeling I really enjoy.
You mentioned your attraction to early music as well, and you also mentioned your brother who's a cellist. And there's this piece, Richikar, from about 2015 or so, Linda, that you wrote, and actually our mutual friend Marina Hasselberg, I know recently released it on her debut album. Beautiful piece and very coloristic, and really I think uses the resources of the cello really to a large degree, but also involves a lot of your specific traits of language and as I mentioned, timbre and color. Was this piece inspired by? I mean, the title evokes sort of some early music pieces in particular. Some perhaps we think of viola da gamba or earlier instruments, bowed instruments. Was this at all affiliated with your brother, or how did this piece initially come to be?
Yeah, this was a commission from a philanthropist in Toronto named Daniel Cooper, who loved new music, and he commissioned many solo pieces. And it was commissioned for Eleanor Fry, who's a Baroque cellist and specialist. And so it was written for Baroque cello, but I chose to write for her Baroque cello that has the same string set up so that a modern cellist could play it as well. And that was a wonderful situation because I wrote the piece, and Eleanor came here, and we actually workshopped it together with the commissioner present, with Daniel with us. So he got to watch that process, and I think he was really delighted to be included. And it was Eleanor who titled the piece because she played through it, and we were talking about, how I was kind of, how the material was sort of varying and searching itself, and how it unfolds in a kind of discovery process. And she said, well, Richard Carr, it's research. And she just like, done. Okay, that's the title. So she was the person to premiere it. And then it's been played by quite a few different cellists since. And the other thing I did with that one is I had initially written in all kinds of dynamics all over the place, and I took them out because Baroque musicians are used to music without dynamics, and they're used to interpretation on that level. And I just thought, well, let's let people interpret. So it taught me something about, the interpretation is just so fascinating to me, and I love working in rehearsal with musicians to see where they're going with something, because it's really collaborative. And I think that's why in the music I write, I can leave a lot of things out. Maybe I used to overthink some articulations and so on, but I think now some pieces, especially solo pieces, it's nice to, here and there I make a few suggestions, or I often use words, but to really let it be, to bear the imprint of the interpreter, and that because they're the ones who live with the piece for so long. And it's nice too that they could interpret it one way one day and then go back to it, should they want to, in a few years, and something else may happen with it.
So you like to allow some license to the interpreter. Are there times where after the workshopping or rehearsal process that you go back and indicate more explicit information in the score, or do you prefer to just leave it open-ended?
Yeah, I do. If there was something that that really was a struggle in some way, or that needed, like, if it seemed like, oh, you know what, if we just have this word here, it makes such a big difference, like a word that indicates either something like rubato, or a word that sometimes it's helpful to have a word that indicates a sense of touch, so if I feel something really needs to be brought out a certain way, I might just put a word like gently, as opposed to harshly. If you use either of those words, it's going to bring out a very different result.
Yeah.
Or fragile, as opposed to just quiet, right? Those evoke immediate reactions in touch.
Yeah.
So I think words are my go-to thing to add. And then usually I have to make sure I do enough cautionary accidentals, because there's a lot of spelling changes over the course of a piece.
Sure. Yeah. This piece, Richard Carr, again, other than the obvious practical considerations, writing it in a secondary version for modern cello probably opens up more possible performances. But what are the immediate differences you find? Obviously, in some elements of timbre and perhaps resonance between the two instruments. Does the piece take on a different kind of character noticeably to you on the early instrument versus the modern instrument? And what are those particular differences in sonority?
Yeah, a little bit it does. I mean, the timbre for sure is quite different, and the bows are shorter in the early music. So the sense of phrase lengths and so on is a bit different. But I actually find there's just more of a difference person to person in terms of what they do with the shaping of the piece.
Interesting. Some years ago, Linda, I think you sent me a piece entitled Drifter. And this is a piece that was commissioned by Brady Works. It looks like, I can't remember exactly from what year it dates, but it used the electric guitar with piano in a very interesting combination, and a rare combination, but I think a very beautifully matched timbral marriage between the two instruments. how did this piece come to be? Please tell us about Drifter.
Yeah, that was from Tim Brady. There, it also exists as acoustic guitar, like as and piano. I made a version. I didn't change anything. Just it says it on the front page that it can be either. Because somebody asked me after they'd heard it, well, could I play it on? I don't play electric guitar. Can I just play it on guitar? And I said, well, give it a try and tell me how you would think. And it does work. It's beautiful. Of course, it's a different matching. Just dynamically, the matching is a little bit different in approach, but it sounds really good. But for the electric guitar, I went and I met with Tim Brady because I really don't. I find guitar very difficult to think about, and electric guitar I had no history with at all. And we looked at his different guitars, and he went through a lot of different things for me. And what I came back with was I need to find a place where they meet. I need to find for myself, where can I get them to meet? And it kind of came down to a registral sound, a chord that I went back to over and over again. And that's how I entered into the world of that work. Was really finding them to meet and join as much as possible. And in the rehearsal situation, we ended up putting the speaker, the amplifier for the guitar, under the piano, so that the sound sources were really coming from the same place, and that was really effective. It worked very well. But like I said, the guitar can also work beautifully just as a guitar and piano, and I think it's been recorded that way. And it's again like the notion of drift, just something that rhythmically has some flux and flow to it, not too much of a steady pulse, but more a slight undulation is something I'm always looking for.
That piece was also recorded on. Was it the album also entitled Drifter, Linda? Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think that's the. I think that might be not an electric guitar on that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. You were affiliated with Array Music. You were the artistic director starting back in 1988, I believe. Were these would have been the early days of that organization, Linda, or?
Yeah, kind of early. I mean, the group started in 71.
71.
Before,
okay.
So that was long before I was in town.
Sure. Yeah.
Or even before I was in Canada.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was maybe its third artistic director, I think. Okay. And I came in a time when we were just solidifying a kind of an ensemble, which was an unusual ensemble of clarinet, trumpet, 2 percussion, piano, violin, and double bass, which was really intriguing because it was like, in a way, mini orchestral, woodwind, brass, strings, percussion, but very difficult, like hugely challenging for any composer to write for. And what I liked about that is that most new music groups were more of the standard Pierrot ensemble: flute, clarinet, piano, percussion, violin, cello. And so it wasn't that. So it had a kind of unique sound, and it was challenging. And what I felt it did was it really brought something out of each composer who wrote for it. Like, people went to the mat trying to make that ensemble work. Mm-hmm. And the key to it for me was having 2 percussion, because the 2 percussion could be in so many different ways. There's so many instruments and so many ways they could help fill out that texture. And it was great working. I learned, I often think of that as my PhD, was when I was director. I don't have a PhD, but when I was director of Array, I was there 5 years, and just learning how to rehearse, how to listen, how to program concerts, everything about, grant writing and all of that. But really it was the rehearsal and interpretive process that I was there to just soak up. I learned so much from it.
Do you ever participate as a performing musician in any of the ensembles or in any other sort of collaborative work these days, Linda? Or are you 100% dedicated to composition now? Or
I don't really. I have played a little bit in Martin Arnold's music when asked. And John Sherlock, I don't know if you know the music of John Sherlock, but he writes for uh, keyboards, so Wurlitzer, all kinds of specialty,
Yeah, like a Fender Rhodes and so forth.
right? So I have played in his pieces, and I would play anytime he asks me. I'm like one of the team that will play in his pieces, and
Oh,
I
very
love
cool.
playing in them.
Do tell John I say hi. He actually wrote me a beautiful set of pieces. It would have been about 8 years ago or so. Sort of mobile pieces, some very short movements and sort of chorale style as well. They're just sort of modular in their presentation. There could be up to a few guitars. Very colorful and beautiful use of harmonic fragments and so forth. And I had heard actually some of these keyboard works you had mentioned on his website at that time, and was really kind of blown away by just the beautiful sonorities and colors, and again, kind of subtle variations and timbral effects between these specific keyboard instruments that he uses. So I actually was not aware that you collaborated with John. That's very cool, Linda.
We met when he took the Young Composers Workshop at Array Music that I had started in the late 80s. He came to it, I think he was in the early 90s, and we met then and became fast friends. So we've been friends ever since. And then I've in his larger pieces that require multiple players, I've been one of the players for those. And I played a duet with my husband Rick for piano and percussion. Beautiful piece. And there's a duet for two pianos that Eve and I have played a few times, Eva Goyen and I, that he wrote for us, called Lilac and Aubergine, and gorgeous piece. So yeah, that's special to me to have something like that I can do and can participate in. And I think it's because it's a kind of music that is not technically virtuoso playing. It's more about listening, and I can bring that to the table, and I understand his music and have a
Mhm.
feeling for it. So,
Oh, beautiful.
and I like having the experience of being an interpreter as well. Yeah.
Yeah. You had hinted at current projects earlier, Linda. Is there anything that you can tell us about as far as upcoming commissions, performances, recordings, anything that you're thinking about even creatively currently?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm doing another solo violin piece for 20 minutes for a wonderful violinist named Maya Bernardo, who lives between New York and Switzerland. And it's why I say it's funny is like, okay, I just did a 70-minute piece for violin. Do I have something to bring to the table here? So I'm continuing my investigation, and the 20 minutes is very different. So that's really interesting. I'm still finishing the hour-long piano piece. I'm about to go to Ireland for I had to write a choir piece for Chamber Choir Ireland for a festival in Dundalk. Wonderful little festival, small town, just such a special situation. Great festival. This year, there is this choir concert, and then they're doing in C with all folk musicians, which I think Irish folk musicians, that should be quite
Very
a
cool.
quite a
Yeah.
wonderful thing. Um, so yeah, the choir. I haven't written a lot for choir, so that's a big deal for me. I need to go and hear, and that's a 20-minute choir piece. So I need to go and rehearse with them and just hear how they feel about it. And then I'll be starting a new work for a group called Cicada in Oslo, which is a kind of a larger chamber ensemble. And that came about because they've been playing some of my pieces. We rehearsed via Zoom, and they're really wonderful. And then they decided they wanted a piece written for them, and that's going to be a 30-minute piece. So
Okay.
again, duration, instrumentation,
Yeah.
interesting to think about.
With regards to the choir piece, perhaps you mentioned, sorry, but the text, is the text set, or is there a source that you're
Yeah,
working from?
that was a bit of an issue. I had when my mother died, I came across this book that she had of Emily Dickinson fragments. They're envelope fragments. They're poems that she'd written on the backs of envelopes, and they're not poems. They're all little fragments that were on their way to becoming poems, perhaps. And it's such a beautiful, and the book is a large book with facsimiles of every envelope. And so I chose a selection of them. I was pulling out the ones that seemed to mean something to me, and in the order that they came in, they created this kind of beautiful poem that for me felt like moving from a kind of a dark place and maybe a little bit lacking of hope place towards light. And that's just the way the fragments came. And so I wrote the piece I worked for about 4 or 5 months on it. And then I found out that Emily Dickinson's work is not public domain. A lot of it is not in public domain. So I had to go to Harvard Press, who owns the copyright, and get so I was a little bit on tenterhooks for a bit because I didn't know if I was going to get permission. So I started rewriting text, keeping the phrases, making my own text to fit.
Yeah.
And I came up with, which was an amazing exercise. I learned so much about her poem by having to write my own lines that had a similar feel or cast of feeling. And then just at the last minute, I did get permission. So I'm using Emily Dickinson, of course. But it was all in the end, a very good experience to go through.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, beautiful. I do look forward to hearing the new compositions when they come out, and please keep me posted. Hopefully we can meet again sometime in person, Linda, next time.
Oh, I hope so, Adrian.
Yeah. And again, thank you for your time today. It was really great to actually get to chat with you and discuss some of your stylistic influences, also your past. I know you lived on the West Coast for some time, and we have a lot of mutual friends as well. So glad to finally be able to have an extended conversation with you, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Adrian. It was really, really fun to talk to you. Great questions.
My pleasure. Yeah, anytime. And we'll be in touch.
Yeah, good.